I'm Thea, I'm 38. And 4 days ago, I sat my mother down at the kitchen table 3 feet from the bathtub where she tried to kill me when I was 18 months old, and I played her the sound of her own voice calling the police 6 minutes before she saved my life. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She looked at my 4-year-old daughter Olive, who was coloring on the floor with crayons the color of sunsets, and she said, "You were always such a dramatic child, Thea, even before you could speak." Then my father, who had been sober for 11 years and absent for 30, stood up from his chair and told her he remembered the water running that afternoon. And the 3 mothers she had saved, after me, walked out of my kitchen with folders in their hands, and for the first time in 4 decades, Margot Brennan was surrounded by witnesses who weren't there to applaud. But that's the end, or the closest thing to an end I've found. To understand why I became a paramedic who can't swim, why I panic at the smell of lavender bubble bath, why I spent 38 years believing I owed my mother a debt that could never be paid in anything but blood and public gratitude, you have to understand the mythology of my childhood. You have to understand that I wasn't raised. I was resurrected. I was 18 months old when I nearly drowned. That's the word everyone used. Nearly. As if death had been a coin toss and my mother had simply called heads. The story was gospel in our town. Margot Brennan, former pediatric nurse, found her baby girl blue and floating in the family bathtub. She performed CPR through tears and prayers, her lips stained with my vomit and bathwater, her arms trembling but never stopping, until the paramedics arrived and declared me a miracle. The local paper ran a photograph of her holding me on our porch swing, both of us wrapped in a single yellow blanket, her face pale and luminous with the light of sainthood. The headline read, "Angel Mother Defeats Death." I grew up in the shadow of that headline. Our house was a shrine to my mother's heroism. The bathtub, a white porcelain clawfoot relic from the 1950s, sat in the bathroom at the end of the hall like an altar. Margot kept the water stain on the ceiling tile above it, a brown bloom shaped like a country neither of us had visited. And when tour groups came through on the annual charity home walk, she would point to it and say, "That's where the water splashed when I lifted her. That's where God reached down and touched us both." People wept, they wrote checks, they pressed $100 bills into her hands and asked her to lay those same hands on their own sick children. I learned to say thank you before I learned to say milk. Thank you for the breath, thank you for the blanket. Thank you for the second life. Margot enrolled me in pageants before I could read, not beauty pageants, but courage pageants, survivor galas, fundraisers for pediatric drowning prevention, where I stood on stages in frilly dresses and recited speeches about gratitude while my mother's hand gripped my shoulder hard enough to leave fingerprints. "Smile, Thea," she would whisper through her teeth while the audience applauded. "Show them how happy you are to be alive." I was happy, or I performed happiness so long and so perfectly that I forgot what the authentic emotion felt like. I became a paramedic at 22, not because I loved medicine, but because I owed a debt to emergency rooms and ambulances. Every intubation, every chest compression, every successful resuscitation was a payment on a loan I hadn't asked for. I saved strangers in the backs of speeding rigs, my knees bruised against metal floors, my hands pressing rhythms into sternums while I thought, "This is what she did for me. This is the weight of the debt. This is the interest," but I couldn't swim. I still can't, not really. At 38, the smell of chlorine makes my throat close. The sound of running bathwater sends my heart into arrhythmia I can feel in my molars. I shower standing up, always, with the curtain half open and the bathroom door unlocked, even when Olive was an infant and I was so exhausted I could barely stand. Margot found this hilarious. "My water baby," she would call me, her voice dripping with that particular syrup she reserved for public consumption. "Still afraid of the thing that gave you back to me." When Olive was born, Margot's interest in her was immediate, clinical, and voracious. She called daily. She sent packages of bath toys, rubber ducks, bubble wands, lavender-scented soaps that I threw in the outside garbage because their smell made me retch. And she begged, with increasing intensity, to bathe Olive alone. "You know I have the training, Thea. You know I saved you. Don't you trust me with your own daughter?" I didn't know why I said no. I said it through clenched teeth, through migraines, through nights where I woke up sweating and couldn't name the nightmare. I said no and I didn't know why, except that some animal part of me, older than language, knew that Margot and water together were a chemistry I didn't want my child near. I made excuses. I lied about schedules. I locked the bathroom door when she visited and ran the fan to cover the sound of olives splashing, as if the noise itself might summon something. Then, 6 months ago, I found the tapes. My partner, Daniel, works for the fire department's communications archive. He's a methodical man, a man who catalogs frequencies and tower locations and treats radio static like endangered language. We were having dinner at his place, a rare night without Olive, who was with a sitter, when he mentioned that the department was digitizing old emergency call recordings from the late 80s and early 90s. Box after box, he said, stirring pasta. Most of it rot. But there's a case from '87 that keeps coming up in training. The Brennan baby. The drowning on Maple, you ever heard of it? I put down my fork. The room tilted slightly, the way rooms tilt when the floor you've stood on for decades reveals itself to be a lid. That was me, I said. Daniel stared at me, then he understood. He reached across the table and took my hand, and I realized I was shaking. Thea, he said quietly, there's something on those tapes you need to hear. I used his keycard the next morning, a Saturday when the archive office was empty except for the hum of servers and the smell of ozone. The boxes were in room 4B, metal shelving units lined with cassette tapes in brittle plastic cases, each labeled with dates and dispatch codes. I found 1987. I found March. I found the label, *03/14/87, Drowning/Infant/Maple Street, Brennan. There were 2 tapes in the case. Not 1. 2, I played the first on a deck Daniel had shown me how to operate. The quality was degraded, the hiss enormous, the voices distant and underwater sounding. But I knew the second voice instantly. It was Margot. Hysterical, breathless, the voice that had launched 1,000 fundraisers. My baby. My baby fell in the tub, she's not breathing. Oh God, please hurry, I'm doing CPR, she's blue. The timestamp on the dispatch log read 14:23. I played the second tape. It was shorter, quieter. A female voice, flat and deliberately monotone, speaking quickly. There's a baby drowning at our address. Send someone now. Then a click. The dispatcher asked for the caller's name. The caller had already hung up. The timestamp read 14:17. 6 minutes. 6 minutes before my mother called back as the devastated heroine. Someone had called from our house, or from the payphone at the corner store 3 blocks away, I would later learn, and reported a drowning in progress. An anonymous tip. A voice that didn't want to be known. I sat in that archive room for an hour, listening to both tapes on loop, matching frequencies, comparing vocal patterns. The anonymous caller's flatness wasn't calm. It was performance. It was a woman trying to strip her own voice of identity while still ensuring the message got through. And underneath the monotone, in the way she pronounced drowning with a slight upswing on the second syllable, in the sharp click of the T in baby, I heard my mother. I heard Margot practicing restraint. I didn't go home. I drove to the corner store, which was now a vape shop, and I stood on the sidewalk where the phone booth had been, and I called in sick to work for the first time in 6 years. Then I started digging. The first mother I found was named Patricia Holcomb. Her son David had been saved by Margot in 1994 at a community pool. David was 3. He had fallen into the deep end while Margot was volunteering as a lifeguard. She had pulled him out, performed CPR, been hailed as a hero. David was now 32. He lived in a group home. He couldn't feed himself. He had anoxic brain injury from the time he spent underwater time that Patricia, when I finally reached her by phone, couldn't account for. She was the only one near him. Patricia told me, her voice careful as if the words might cut her tongue. I turned to get his towel. When I turned back, she was already pulling him out. She said he had been underwater for almost 4 minutes. But Thea, I had just looked at him. It couldn't have been more than 30 seconds. The second mother was Gloria Vance. Her daughter, Amy, had an allergic reaction to peanuts at a birthday party in 2001. Margot administered an EpiPen she happened to carry, saved Amy's life, became a local hero again. But Gloria told me that the peanut cookies at that party had been Margot's contribution, and that Amy had been in the kitchen alone with Margot when Gloria heard her start to choke. The third was the worst. Lena Torres. Her son Mateo fell down the stairs at Margot's house in 1996. He was 4. Margot was babysitting. She called 911, performed first aid, held his neck perfectly still until the ambulance arrived. Mateo died 2 days later from swelling in his brain. The official story was a tragic accident. But Lena told me, through tears that had not stopped in 28 years, that she had always wondered why Mateo was upstairs at all. He was afraid of those stairs. He never went up alone, but Margot told me later she had been teaching him to be brave. She said he ran up to get a toy she had left up there, a toy I had never seen before. I collected them like evidence in a case I hadn't known I was building. 3 children, 3 emergencies, 3 moments of public glory for Margot Brennan, angel mother. And in each case, she had been the only adult present. She had been the architect of the crisis and the savior of the aftermath. But the diary was what broke me. I found it in the attic of her house, my childhood home, when Margot was in Florida visiting a spiritual retreat for healthcare heroes. I still had a key. I told myself I was checking for a leak. Instead, I climbed the pull-down ladder into the dark, hot space where my old toys were boxed and my pageant trophies gathered dust, and I found a cedar chest locked with a combination padlock. The combination was my birthday, of course it was. The diary was leather-bound, filled with Margot's precise nursing handwriting. The entries began in 1985, 2 years before my drowning. They described a feeling she had trouble naming, a hollowness that only filled when people needed her, a godlike emptiness that regular life could not satisfy. Then, March 14, 1987, the entry was 3 pages long. I read it sitting cross-legged on the attic floor, breathing dust and insulation, my phone flashlight trembling on the page. Asterisk, I filled the tub warm, not hot, warm like the womb she should never have left. I held her under and I felt the fight leave her small body, and then I felt it, the celestial euphoria, the resurrection power, the only love that matters. When I pulled her up and she gasped, when I put my mouth on hers and forced her back, I was God. I was better than God. God didn't have to work for it, I earned her life. And now she owes me forever, they all will. Every time I save one I own them, and being owned is the only way they'll ever truly love me. Asterisk, I didn't scream. I didn't throw up, though my body wanted to. I photographed every page with shaking hands, downloaded them to 3 separate clouds, and I put the diary back exactly as I had found it. Then I went home and I held Olive while she slept, and I counted her breaths. 1, 2, 3, 4, and I understood that my entire life had been built on a baptism of murder. I knew I couldn't go to the police. Not yet. Margot was too beloved, too entrenched, too legally protected by decades of documented heroism. A diary entry and some old phone tapes might get me a psychiatric evaluation, or a lawsuit for slander, or a custody battle that Margot would win because she was the sainted grandmother, and I was, by her narrative, the traumatized daughter who couldn't even bathe her own child without anxiety. I needed witnesses. I needed the other mothers. I needed my father. Henry Brennan had left when I was 8. I remembered him as a smell, whiskey, sawdust, and the cheap aftershave he wore to cover the whiskey, and as a silence that filled the house like water before a storm. He left after my second accident, a fall down the basement stairs that Margot said happened while he was supposed to be watching me. I had a concussion. Henry had a drinking problem. The math was simple. He packed a bag and he was gone. But he had called me out of the blue 2 years ago. Sober 11 years, living in a studio apartment across town, working at a hardware store and going to meetings in church basements. I should have fought for you, he said on that first call, his voice cracked and unfamiliar. I knew something was wrong with her, I just didn't know how to name it without naming myself a failure. I met him for coffee. I didn't tell him about the tapes, not then. But I watched him. I watched the way his hands shook when he spoke about Margot, the way he looked at Olive's photographs on my phone with a hunger that bordered on grief. And I knew that if the moment came, Henry would choose truth. He had nothing left to lose except the guilt he had carried for 3 decades. I called the 3 mothers. Patricia, Gloria, Lena. I told them everything I had found. I asked them to come to my mother's house on a Saturday evening in October. I told them I was hosting an early birthday dinner for Olive, a small family gathering to honor the grandmother who gave me life. I told Margot the same thing. She was delighted. She loved being honored. It was her favorite nutrient. Henry arrived first. He wore a blazer that didn't fit him, borrowed from his sponsor, and he carried a bouquet of sunflowers that Olive immediately claimed for her own. He kissed my cheek and whispered, "I'm here, whatever happens." The mothers arrived an hour early, as I had asked. I let them in through the kitchen door and seated them in the breakfast nook, hidden from the dining room by a swinging door that had been there since my childhood. I gave them tea. I gave them the folders I had prepared, copies of the 911 tapes, transcripts of the diary, medical records they had brought themselves. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. We were a jury of the wounded waiting for the defendant to take the stand. Margot arrived at 6, wearing a silk blouse the color of surgical scrubs and pearls that had been a gift from the mayor after she saved a councilman's grandson from choking on a grape. She swept in with the fragrance of lavender and power, and she scooped Olive up in her arms before I could intervene. "There's my girl," she cooed, pressing her lips to Olive's hair. "The spitting image of your mama at this age. Do you know, Olive, that I once saved your mommy's life?" I pulled her right out of the water and breathed life back into her tiny body. "You owe me a thank you, don't you?" Olive squirmed. "I want crayons." Margot set her down with a tight smile. "Of course, the artistic temperament runs in the family." We sat at the dining table, the same table where I had eaten 1,000 meals of silence and performance. The bathroom was visible from my seat, its door ajar, the clawfoot tub gleaming white in the overhead light like a waiting mouth. Henry sat to my left. Margot took the head of the table, her throne since before I was born. Olive sat in her booster seat, coloring on a paper tablecloth I had bought specifically so she would have something to do while the adults performed their tragedy. Margot raised her wine glass. "To family," she said. "To second chances. To the love that pulls us back from the edge, again and again." Henry didn't raise his glass, he looked at me. I looked at the bathroom door. Then I reached under my chair and I brought out the portable speaker I had hidden there, a sleek black rectangle that looked like a phone charger. "Mom," I said. "Before we eat, I wanted to do something special. You always tell the story so beautifully. The drowning, the rescue, would you tell it tonight, for Olive, so she knows where she comes from?" Margot's eyes lit up. This was her favorite request. Her origin myth, her genesis, her reason for being. "Of course, darling." She set down her glass. She folded her hands. She looked at Olive, then at Henry, then at me, and she began. She told it the way she always had. The warm bath, the phone ringing, she had been expecting a call from her sister. The moment of distraction. The silence from the bathroom that turned to dread. The water that was too still. She described finding me floating, blue, my eyes open and sightless. She described the CPR, the breath, the way my small chest rose under her palms like a miracle. She cried, real tears. I had to hand it to her. She was the greatest actress I had ever known, and I had been her captive audience for 38 years. When she finished, the room was silent except for Olive's crayon scratching paper. Margot wiped her eyes and smiled, triumphant, already reaching for her wine. "Beautiful," I said. "Truly. But I found something in the fire department archives. A tape from that day. Would you like to hear it?" I didn't wait for her answer. I pressed play. The speaker filled the room with static, then the flat, anonymous voice. Asterisk, "There's a baby drowning at our address. Send someone now." Asterisk, click. Then the dispatcher's voice, confused, asking for name, then silence. Margot's smile didn't falter. "What is this, Thea? Some kind of prank?" "It's the first call," I said. "Made at 14:17. 6 minutes before your call at 14:23. Someone in this house, or near it, knew I was drowning before you discovered me. Someone who didn't leave a name." "That's absurd. That could have been anyone, a neighbor, a passerby." "It was you," Henry said. His voice was quiet, steady, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this moment in sobriety for 11 years. He stood up, his hands flat on the table, and he looked at Margot with an expression that was not hate. It was recognition, the recognition of a disease he had finally learned to name. "I was here that day," he said. "I was supposed to be at work, but I came home sick. I was asleep in the guest room. I heard you run the bath. I heard you go in with Thea. I heard silence. Then I heard you leave the house. I heard the screen door slam. I thought you were getting mail. Then I heard you come back. And I heard you start screaming. By the time I got to the bathroom, you were doing CPR and the ambulance was already coming. I didn't understand what I had heard until years later. I told myself I was drunk. I told myself I was crazy, but I wasn't. I was sober enough to know that my wife had left our baby in a bathtub and called the police before she saved her." Margot's face shifted. The mask cracked, not into guilt, but into calculation. She was already searching for the exit, the spin, the way to make this about my instability, about Henry's alcoholism, about a family dinner gone wrong. "You were a drunk," she said, her voice sharpening. "You abandoned your child. No one will believe you." "Maybe not," I said, "but they'll believe them." I nodded toward the kitchen door. It swung open. Patricia Holcomb walked in first. She carried a folder thick with David's medical records, his group home intake forms, his photographs as a child before the pool and after. Gloria Vance followed, holding a peanut butter cookie recipe card in a plastic bag, the one Margot had written out for the birthday party, the one that had contained enough oil to mask the texture of ground peanuts. Lena Torres came last. She carried nothing but a photograph of Mateo at 3, smiling in a red sweater, alive and whole and trusting. They stood at the edge of the dining room, 3 mothers in a semicircle, and they looked at Margot with the same expression I had seen in my own mirror for decades. The look of someone who has finally understood that the angel was the architect. "David can't speak," Patricia said. "But I can, you held him under. I know you did. I saw your face when you pulled him out. You weren't scared, you were glowing." "Amy almost died because of your cookies," Gloria said. "And you had that EpiPen ready before she even took a bite. You told me you always carried one, you knew." Lena didn't speak. She simply placed Mateo's photograph on the table, inches from Margot's wine glass, and she looked at her with a silence that was heavier than any accusation. Margot stood up. Her chair scraped against the floor. She looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw her without the halo. She was a woman in a silk blouse, standing in a house she had turned into a museum of her own heroism, surrounded by the evidence that her miracles had been manufactured in bathtubs and swimming pools and kitchens. She was not a monster. She was worse. She was a woman who had mistaken need for love and who had been willing to drown children to feel herself breathe them back to life. "You owe me nothing," I said. I picked up Olive. She wrapped her legs around my waist and buried her face in my neck, smelling of crayons and safety. "Not gratitude, not breath, not a lifetime of performance on stages you built. You tried to kill me to become a god, and now you get to live in a world where nobody worships you." I walked toward the door. Henry followed me. The 3 mothers stayed where they were, not to attack, not to scream, but to bear witness. To let Margot see the faces she had used as stepping stones. To let her understand that the congregation was over. We drove home in silence. Olive fell asleep in her car seat, her hand clutching a sunflower from Henry's bouquet. Henry sat in the passenger seat, staring at his hands, and I knew he was seeing the ghost of every drink he had poured to forget what he knew. "She won't go to prison," he said finally. "The statute, the evidence, it's too old, too circumstantial." "I know," I said. "Then what was this for?" I thought about the diary entry, the celestial euphoria, the godlike emptiness. And I thought about the bathtub in my own house, the one I had never used for Olive, the one I cleaned with my eyes averted. "For the mothers," I said. "For David and Amy and Mateo, for me, for the little girl who grew up saying thank you to the woman who held her under, and for this." I reached over and took his hand. It was dry and warm and shaking. "For you, for believing me now, even though you couldn't then." Margot's reputation didn't collapse overnight. It eroded. Patricia spoke to a journalist. Gloria posted in a mother's group online. Lena went to the parish priest who had once called Margot a saint. The stories spread slowly, like water staining paper, until the fundraisers stopped calling, the invitations stopped coming, and the yellow blanket from the famous photograph was seen for what it was, a shroud that had been used to smother truth. I left the ambulance service 6 months later. I opened a small storefront downtown with money I had saved for 15 years of double shifts. I called it the Second Breath, and it offered free CPR classes for parents, grandparents, babysitters, anyone who wanted to learn how to save a life without needing to own it. The first thing I taught in every class, before the chest compressions, before the breaths, was this: if you ever meet someone who tells you that you owe them your life, run. Real rescue doesn't come with debt. And I learned to swim. At 38, in the municipal pool 3 blocks from my apartment, I enrolled in a mother-daughter class with Olive. The first time I put my face in the water, I hyperventilated. The instructor, a college student named Jake who didn't know my history, simply said, "Take your time, the water isn't going anywhere." He was wrong. The water was always going somewhere. It was going into drains, into clouds, into rivers that carried everything away. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of where it might take me. Olive and I float on our backs now, side by side, our ears submerged so the world sounds like a heartbeat. She holds my hand. I hold hers. We look up at the ceiling of the pool, at the lights refracted through chlorine, and we breathe. That's my story. If someone ever made you grateful for pain they caused, if someone ever called themselves your savior while tying you to the rock they claim to have rolled away, if someone ever told you that love was a debt that only death could settle, hear me. You don't owe them your breath. You don't owe them your stage. You don't owe them your child's trust, or your father's silence, or your own terrified devotion. You owe them nothing. Not even the satisfaction of your fear.